This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 1310. 3 Habits That Are Costing You Hundreds of Thousands, Part 1, by Nick True of mappedoutmoney.com. And I'm your host and personal finance enthusiast, Diana Merriam. This is the show where I read to you from some of the best blogs on personal finance today and every day. And if you have a question you'd like featured on the show, go ahead and shoot us an email at finance@oldpodcast.com. You just might be featured on a future episode. Don't forget that we have other shows in our network that focus on topics like personal development, health, and relationships. Just search for Optimal Living Daily wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll find 5 other shows for your listening pleasure. But for now, let's get right into today's post and continue optimizing your life. 3 Habits That Are Costing You Hundreds of Thousands, Part 1, by Nick True of mappedoutmoney.com. We all have habits that we do daily or even weekly that cost us money. Most of the time, they're really little, like a cup of coffee or eating out for lunch. But just how much do these innocent purchases cost us over time? Let's take a look into 3 everyday habits that sometimes can turn into much bigger monsters than we could ever imagine. Little habits turn into big costs. This is super important. What seems like only a small amount of money at the time turns into a huge chunk of cash once that small purchase becomes a habit. The problem is that when we only do it once a day or even every other day, we don't think about it adding up. If you don't track your spending, it really goes by unnoticed because these small habits are typically only a few dollars at a time. A lot of people think that when it comes to spending, you really need to focus on the big things and not worry about the little things. I agree with that to a certain extent. If you mess up the big purchases like college tuition, cars, and houses, then what you do with the small things isn't going to matter much. However, I would argue that we still need to pay attention to the small stuff because that's where you can waste a ton of money without even noticing. Let's dive in. Daily coffee. This one is tough, and I'll be the first one to admit I love my morning coffee. But if you're running by Starbucks or that little hippie coffee shop a block from work every single morning, you might as well hook a vacuum up to your wallet. I mean, seriously, you have no idea how much money that daily coffee is actually costing you. I'm going to go through some math, so just try to bear with me without your eyes glazing over. My buddy Luke works at a local Starbucks, and based on his expert memory skills, claims that about half of the people who come to his Starbucks every day are 5 days a week regular Starbucks goers. Now, I'm not sure if that represents most of the population, but I think it's safe to assume that there are a ton of people who just gotta have their cup of joe every morning on the way to the office. I have a handful of friends that fall into this category, and I'd be willing to bet that you do too. So how much money does that person spend? Well, $3.25 for the average Starbucks drink may not sound like a lot, but it adds up for those everyday visitors. If you spend $3.25 on coffee 5 days a week, that works out to $65 a month. Okay, so maybe that's not too bad until you look at the yearly cost of $780. Now we're talking enough money for a 3 to 5 day beach trip that you spent slurping back your favorite Frappuccino. But what happens if we do this for a few years? After 10 years of having your daily Java, you've spent $7,800. Let me say that again, $7,800 on coffee. You could have bought a car, but instead wasted it on a morning drink. Extend this out for your entire working career, and 40 years later, you've spent $31,200 on coffee. Coffee! Let that sink in. For all those visual learners out there, I put together a nice little spreadsheet that really shows the cost of coffee over those years. For a $3.25 coffee 5 days a week, the average monthly cost is $65. The average yearly cost is $780, and that's almost $20,000 after 25 years. Okay, I know some of you still aren't convinced to quit your daily Starbucks run. But let's talk about what happens if instead of morning coffee, you invested that money. Here's where the numbers start to really get interesting. Let's take the money you would have spent on coffee and invest that into a nice total stock market index fund that produces an average 6% per year. Let's say you invest that money monthly and see what happens. After 10 years of investing, that money is worth $10,652. We're already up almost $3,000 compared to the amount spent after 10 years. If you do this for 20 years, that coffee turns into 30 grand. So instead of spending $325 a day on coffee, you invest that money, you can have an extra 30 grand after 20 years. Now, what happens if we extend this out for your entire working career? The numbers get crazy. After 40 years, that daily coffee would have made close to $130,000. That, my friends, is insane. We're talking about enough money to purchase a house. You could buy a house with the money spent on coffee for a full working career. Hashtag mind blown. So what should you do? Well, let's be honest. I don't expect you to give up coffee altogether and start investing $325 every day, although that'd be pretty awesome. Instead, why don't you consider making your coffee at home every morning before you head out? Let me break it down. My wife and I both drink a standard 16-ounce Tervis tumbler coffee 5 days a week. Gotta have that Tervis. We do most of our grocery shopping at the local Sam's Club where everything is bigger and better. The coffee costs around $10.98 for a 48-ounce jumbo-size Folgers Classic roast. We get our favorite 64-ounce vanilla caramel creamer for $5.32. And then we get our massive 700-count Brew Right coffee filters for $2.98. We can get 190 Tervis-sized cups of coffee out of Folgers. We both use 2 ounces of creamer for each Tervis, getting 32 cups for the 64-ounce creamer. And we get 700 cups of coffee out of the coffee filters. We have to double up the coffee filters because we've got a leaky coffee pot. So 2 cups every morning for 2 coffee filters. If you plug those numbers into a fancy-dancy spreadsheet, you can see that my daily cup of joe only costs me 23 cents per cup. Can't beat that with a stick. This means that I spend an average $4.60 per month, or $55.20 per year for my cup of coffee every morning. That works out to $12,677 if I invested that 23 cents instead for 40 years. I'll happily pay that compared to the almost $130,000 from the Starbucks spending. I'm not telling you to give up your coffee drinking, because I'm sure not giving up mine. But if you're a coffee house every morning kind of person, I encourage you to rethink that habit. Maybe you should cut down to once a week splurging on that special Starbucks coffee. And the rest of the time, just make a nice cup of joe at home. That will free up a crazy amount of money that you could save or spend somewhere else that's way more important than a fancy cup of coffee. You just listened to part 1 of the post titled 3 Habits That Are Costing You Hundreds of Thousands by Nick True of mappedoutmoney.com. I'll finish the rest for you tomorrow where we'll hear Nick's thoughts on smoking. I think the fun thing about analyzing our daily spending habits to look for efficiencies is that we may even discover more enjoyable ways to get our needs met. Like Nick, I make my coffee at home every morning, and I enjoy this process of waking up, putting on a pot of water to boil while I do some light stretching and slowly pushing down the lid on my French press before curling up on the couch for some journaling and meditation. It feels so much more relaxing to me than waiting in line at Starbucks. I also used to buy a lot of books, but now I just place a hold online at my local library and I take a stroll with my dog when the book comes in. I get the benefit of some exercise and having a nice chat with the librarian when I go to pick up my book. And that should do it for today. Have a happy rest of your day and a great weekend if you're listening in real time. And I'll see you in the Sunday show tomorrow, where we'll finish up this post and where your optimal life awaits.